Kindness is often misunderstood as a social lubricant, a way to keep interactions smooth and conflict-free. But authentic kindness does the opposite. It disrupts, it reveals, it exposes what people work very hard not to see within themselves. When kindness is rooted in self-awareness rather than approval-seeking, it becomes a psychological mirror that reflects the inner state of those who encounter it. Most people are not disturbed by cruelty. Cruelty fits neatly into their internal narratives about the world being unfair, hostile, or broken. It confirms what they already believe. But kindness, especially calm, grounded, unprovoked kindness, creates a problem. It introduces a contradiction. It quietly asks a question no one wants to answer. If this person can act with integrity despite their wounds, why can't I? This is where discomfort begins. A psychologically integrated form of kindness does not beg for recognition. It does not explain itself. It does not overfunction to manage other people's emotions. It simply exists. And in existing, it exposes avoidance, resentment, and unexamined guilt in others. People sense this immediately, even if they cannot articulate it. Something in them tightens. Something becomes defensive. Because kindness, when genuine, highlights the difference between reaction and choice. Those who live reactively rely on circumstances to justify their behavior. They need reasons for their bitterness. They need stories that excuse their hardness. But when they encounter someone who remains kind without being naive, open without being submissive, and compassionate without self-betrayal, those stories start to crack. The mind scrambles to protect itself. So the kindness is reinterpreted. It becomes manipulation. It becomes weakness. It becomes moral superiority. Anything except what it actually is. This is projection at work. When people cannot tolerate an internal tension, they displace it outward. Your kindness forces a confrontation with parts of themselves they have neglected. Empathy they abandoned. Responsibility they postponed. Courage they avoided. Instead of turning inward, they turn against you. It feels safer to attack the mirror than to examine the reflection. This is why kindness often provokes hostility rather than gratitude. Not because it wounds, but because it unmasks. A person who has compromised themselves repeatedly will feel accused by your consistency, even if you never criticize them. A person who has chosen comfort over growth will feel judged by your discipline, even if you never speak a word. Your presence alone becomes destabilizing because it represents a path they consciously or unconsciously rejected. And the psyche does not forgive easily what it knows it has betrayed. There's also another layer that makes kindness so threatening. It removes the moral high ground of victimhood. Many people survive by clinging to the belief that life has wronged them beyond repair. This belief gives them permission to stagnate, to resent, to withdraw. But when they encounter someone who has suffered and yet chosen not to harden, that belief loses its authority. Your kindness says, suffering did not have to make me cruel. And that implication feels like theft. It robs people of their justification. This is why kindness that is psychologically integrated often stands alone. It does not blend into the collective emotional climate. It does not participate in shared bitterness or group resentment. It does not bond through complaint. It refuses to collude with despair, and the collective does not reward those who refuse to participate in its unconscious contracts. Instead, it tests them, it provokes them, it misinterprets them, it isolates them, because isolation is a way the group attempts to neutralize what it cannot assimilate. But this isolation is not punishment, it is initiation. Those who remain kind without losing their boundaries are forced into deeper self-reliance. They learn to source their worth internally rather than socially. They learn to stand without applause. They learn to tolerate misunderstanding without collapsing into explanation. This is the quiet strength that kindness, when mature, forges. It is not softness. It is not passivity. It is not compliance. It is the ability to see clearly without needing to dominate, to remain humane without needing agreement, and to act from inner authority rather than external reward. And this is why kindness functions as a psychological mirror. It reflects not who others pretend to be, but who they have become through their choices. Some will look and feel inspired. Others will look and feel exposed. The difference has nothing to do with you, and everything to do with what they are willing to confront within themselves. Kindness reveals the distance between a person's values and their behavior, between their potential and their habits, between their self-image and their lived reality. And that distance, once seen, demands a reckoning that many would rather avoid at any cost. Remaining unconscious is often mistaken for peace. On the surface, it looks like ease, fewer questions, fewer inner conflicts, fewer moments of self-doubt. But what appears calm is usually numbness, and what feels like stability is often stagnation. The hidden cost of staying unconscious is not paid all at once. It is paid slowly, quietly, over a lifetime. Unconsciousness means living on borrowed explanations, beliefs inherited rather than examined, reactions repeated rather than understood. People who remain unconscious move through life guided by habits they did not choose and fears they never confronted. They call this normal. They call this reality. But beneath that familiarity is a constant, low-grade tension that never fully disappears, because the psyche knows when it is being avoided. Every time a person ignores an inner contradiction, something splits. One part adapts to survive, to please, to belong. Another part retreats, carrying unexpressed anger, grief, or potential. This fragmentation does not announce itself loudly. It shows up as irritability, chronic dissatisfaction, envy toward those who seem more alive, or an undefined sense that life is happening somewhere else. The unconscious always collects interest. Avoided responsibility becomes resentment. Suppressed truth becomes anxiety. Unlived potential becomes bitterness. These are not moral failures. They are psychological consequences. The mind does not forget what the individual refuses to integrate. It waits. It repeats patterns. It recreates situations until awareness is forced or collapse occurs. Staying unconscious also carries a social cost. People who have not examined themselves depend heavily on external validation. They need agreement to feel safe. They need group consensus to feel real. This makes them highly sensitive to anyone who does not mirror their assumptions. A person who lives consciously, even quietly, becomes a threat to that fragile structure. Not because they attack it, but because they do not need it. This is why unconscious systems punish awareness. They label it arrogance, rebellion, or instability. They attempt to shame those who step outside unspoken rules. Remaining unconscious keeps the group intact, predictable, and emotionally manageable. Awareness introduces uncertainty, responsibility, and change. Most people choose belonging over truth without realizing the trade they have made. Another hidden cost is the erosion of agency. When actions are driven by unexamined impulses, people feel as though life is happening to them rather than being shaped by them. They blame circumstances, relationships, fate, or history. This blame temporarily relieves discomfort, but it also strips away power. Over time, a quiet helplessness sets in, disguised as realism. This is why unconsciousness often presents as cynicism. Cynicism protects against disappointment by lowering expectations. It is not wisdom, it is a defense. And defenses, when mistaken for identity, slowly suffocate vitality. The unconscious person may appear practical, grounded, even mature, but internally they feel confined by choices they never consciously made. The cost extends into relationships. Unconscious people relate through projection. They assign roles instead of seeing individuals. They seek completion from others rather than integration within themselves. This creates cycles of idealization and resentment, closeness and withdrawal. When relationships fail, they repeat the same patterns with different faces, convinced the problem lies outside them. Awareness disrupts this repetition. It introduces accountability. But accountability is expensive. It requires grieving illusions, abandoning familiar narratives, and tolerating uncertainty. Staying unconscious avoids this pain in the short term. The long-term cost is a life lived reactively, guided by shadows rather than choices. There is also a moral cost, rarely acknowledged. Unconsciousness allows harm to continue without malice. People repeat behaviors that wound others while insisting they had no intention to do so. They excuse themselves by citing stress, upbringing, or personality. Without awareness, intention becomes irrelevant. Impact accumulates regardless. This is how people participate in systems they claim to oppose. The unconscious person does not feel like a villain. They feel like a victim of circumstances. This self-image is comforting, but it comes at the price of growth. To remain unconscious, one must continually sacrifice honesty, curiosity, and responsibility. Over time, this sacrifice hardens into character. What makes the cost hidden is that it is normalized. Entire cultures are built on distraction, avoidance, and surface-level solutions. Depth is inconvenient. Reflection is inefficient. Awareness threatens productivity and predictability. So unconsciousness is rewarded with belonging, while consciousness is met with resistance. But the psyche does not measure success by social approval. It measures wholeness, and wholeness cannot be achieved without bringing what is hidden into awareness. The longer this is delayed, the more forcefully life intervenes through crisis, loss, or breakdown, not as punishment, but as correction. Staying unconscious feels safe until the moment it becomes unbearable, and by then the cost has already been paid in missed opportunities, shallow connections, and a quiet sense of inner absence that no amount of comfort can fully explain. Moral consistency unsettles people not because it is loud or aggressive, but because it is stable. It does not fluctuate to accommodate moods, trends, or social convenience. It remains intact under pressure, and that steadiness exposes the fragility of systems built on compromise and contradiction. When someone lives in alignment with their values over time, others begin to feel uncomfortable without fully understanding why. Most people do not live inconsistently because they are malicious. They do so because consistency requires awareness, sacrifice, and the willingness to endure inner conflict. It demands that a person confront the gap between what they believe and how they behave. For many, that gap is too painful to examine. So it is managed through rationalization. Moral flexibility becomes survival strategy rather than choice. When a morally consistent individual enters this environment, the strategy stops working. Consistency removes the gray area people hide in. It does not accuse, but it clarifies. It makes visible the silent negotiations others make with their conscience. A person who refuses to bend for convenience becomes a reference point, and reference points are threatening because they allow comparison. Comparison invites self-evaluation, and self-evaluation invites responsibility. Hostility often emerges at this stage. People rarely say, "Your integrity makes me question myself." Instead, they say, "You're rigid, you're judgmental, or you think you're better than everyone else." These accusations are psychological defenses. They protect against the discomfort of recognizing one's own compromises. By reframing consistency as arrogance, the observer avoids confronting their internal conflict. Moral consistency also disrupts social cohesion built on shared excuses. Groups often bond through mutual blind spots. Certain behaviors are tolerated as long as everyone participates in ignoring their implications. When someone refuses to participate, they are seen as a threat to unity, not because they attack the group, but because they expose its foundation. This is why consistent individuals are often pressured to lighten up, be realistic, or stop taking things so seriously. These phrases are not invitations to balance. They are requests to abandon standards that make others uncomfortable. The demand is subtle but persistent. Compromise so we don't have to change. Those who remain consistent pay a social price. They are excluded from informal networks. They are left out of conversations where values are traded for advantage. They are misunderstood as cold or unfeeling because they do not perform moral outrage selectively. Their boundaries are interpreted as moral condemnation even when none is intended. The hostility intensifies because moral consistency cannot be easily manipulated. People who shift their values can be negotiated with. They can be influenced, pressured, or incentivized. Consistent individuals resist these forces, not through defiance, but through clarity. This makes them unpredictable within systems that rely on emotional leverage. Another reason consistency provokes hostility is that it collapses moral relativism. When someone lives by principles, even when it costs them, they demonstrate that values are not merely rhetorical. This challenges the belief that everyone would act the same way under pressure. It exposes the lie that compromise is inevitable. For those who have built their identity around that lie, this is destabilizing. Moral consistency also interrupts cycles of projection. People often justify their behavior by pointing to others who do the same or worse. A consistent person removes that escape route. Their presence forces individuals to face their choices without the comfort of comparison. This can feel isolating and confronting, and confrontation is frequently met with aggression. Importantly, the hostility is rarely conscious. People feel irritated, uneasy, or defensive without knowing why. They search for flaws to justify these feelings. Minor imperfections are magnified. Past mistakes are resurrected. Hypocrisy is assumed even where it does not exist. The goal is not accuracy, but relief from discomfort. Consistent individuals often respond by questioning themselves. They wonder if they are being too strict or too idealistic. This doubt is part of the pressure to conform. The environment rewards moral flexibility with acceptance and punishes integrity with isolation. Over time, this wears people down unless their values are internally anchored. What sustains moral consistency is not superiority, but self-respect. It is the refusal to betray oneself for temporary harmony. This refusal is what others sense and resist. It represents a freedom they have not claimed and a responsibility they have avoided. Hostility toward moral consistency is ultimately a reaction to unintegrated guilt. It is the psyche's attempt to silence a reminder of what it knows but does not want to face. The consistent person becomes a symbol, not of judgment, but of possibility. And possibility is threatening when it reveals how much has been sacrificed to remain comfortable. Projection is one of the mind's most efficient defenses. It allows a person to avoid inner conflict by relocating it onto someone else. What cannot be tolerated internally is assigned externally, transformed into accusation, suspicion, or contempt. This process is rarely conscious. It feels justified, even righteous, because it protects the individual from confronting guilt that threatens their self-image. Guilt does not always arise from wrongdoing. Often it emerges from unfulfilled responsibility, avoided truth, or unrealized potential. A person may feel guilty not because they harmed someone, but because they failed themselves. This kind of guilt is particularly difficult to face because it has no clear resolution. It cannot be undone through apology or repair. It requires change, and change is threatening. When such guilt remains unexamined, it seeks an outlet. Encountering someone who embodies what has been neglected can trigger intense emotional reactions. The other person does not need to criticize or compare. Their mere presence is enough. They represent a path not taken, a value not lived, or a courage not claimed. The guilt that arises feels intolerable, so the psyche searches for a way to discharge it. Hatred becomes that discharge. By turning guilt outward, the individual experiences relief. The internal tension is replaced with external blame. The narrative shifts from "I failed myself" to "you are the problem." This transformation is emotionally efficient. It preserves the self-image while providing a target for the discomfort. Projection distorts perception. Neutral actions are reinterpreted as hostile. Boundaries are seen as rejection. Calmness is read as arrogance. Integrity is labeled hypocrisy. The projected qualities often reveal more about the projector than the projected. What is hated most intensely is usually what is least integrated within the self. This is why projection is so convincing. It feels like insight, not avoidance. People genuinely believe their judgments when they project. The emotional charge behind them adds credibility. Anger feels truthful. Disgust feels moral. Contempt feels discerning. These emotions create certainty, and certainty silences doubt. The individual no longer has to question themselves. They have found their answer in someone else's supposed flaw. Projection also serves a social function. Shared hatred creates bonds. Groups often form around a common enemy, real or imagined. When individuals with similar unexamined guilt encounter a consistent or integrated person, they may unconsciously collude in projecting their discomfort. The group reinforces the narrative, making it feel objective and justified. This collective projection is powerful. It isolates the target and protects the group from self-examination. Any attempt by the projected upon individual to clarify or defend themselves is interpreted as further evidence of guilt. Silence is seen as arrogance. Explanation is seen as manipulation. There is no winning because the process is not about truth, but about containment of anxiety. Those who are projected upon often feel confused at first. They sense hostility without clear cause. They may attempt to adjust their behavior, soften their presence, or seek understanding. This rarely works. Projection is not resolved through appeasement. It dissolves only when the projector takes responsibility for their internal state, something they are actively avoiding. Over time, repeated projection can have a corrosive effect on the recipient. Self-doubt creeps in. They begin to question their intentions, their values, their reality. This is why psychological boundaries are essential. Without them, the projected guilt of others can be internalized, leading to shame that does not belong to the individual. Understanding projection restores clarity. It reveals that hatred is often a confession rather than an accusation. What is attacked externally is usually feared internally. What is condemned in others is often what the individual is unwilling to confront within themselves. Recognizing this does not require superiority or detachment. It requires discernment. Projection thrives in unconsciousness. Awareness disrupts it by returning responsibility to its rightful place. When individuals become conscious of their inner conflicts, the need to externalize diminishes. Guilt can be examined, grieved, and transformed rather than weaponized. Those who trigger projection by living with integrity often become symbols. They are seen not as individuals, but as representations of what others avoid. This is why reactions can feel disproportionate or irrational. Intensity has little to do with the present interaction and everything to do with unresolved internal material. Hatred born of projection is never truly about the other person. It is about preserving a fragile self-image at any cost. As long as guilt remains unintegrated, the psyche will continue to look outward for enemies rather than inward for understanding, repeating the cycle of accusation and denial that keeps growth safely out of reach. Inner authority emerges when a person no longer relies on external permission to validate their choices, values, or direction. It is not rebellion, and it is not indifference. It is the quiet certainty that one's decisions are rooted in internal alignment rather than social approval. This certainty brings clarity, but it also brings loneliness, because most human connection is built on shared dependence rather than shared independence. From early life, individuals are conditioned to outsource judgment. Approval becomes safety, agreement becomes belonging. To question this arrangement is to risk exclusion. When someone begins to trust their own inner compass, they disrupt these learned patterns. They no longer seek constant reassurance, and they no longer offer it in return. This shift is subtle, but it is deeply unsettling to those who remain dependent on external cues. Inner authority creates a different rhythm of interaction. People accustomed to emotional negotiation feel disoriented. They look for signals to adjust their behavior, to gain influence, to establish hierarchy. The person guided by inner authority does not provide these signals. They are not easily provoked, flattered, or coerced. Their responses are measured, their boundaries clear. This absence of emotional hooks can be misinterpreted as detachment or superiority. The loneliness begins here. Without intending to, the individual steps outside familiar relational scripts. Conversations become shallower. Invitations become fewer, not because of hostility, but because the dynamic no longer feels predictable. Inner authority, removes the comfort of mutual dependency. It reveals how many connections were sustained by validation loops rather than genuine resonance. There is also an internal loneliness that accompanies this shift. When external approval loses its power, old motivations fall away. Achievements no longer carry the same emotional reward. Praise feels pleasant but irrelevant. Criticism feels informative but not defining. This recalibration creates a void where familiar emotional highs once lived. That void is often mistaken for emptiness. In reality, it is space. Space for discernment, restraint, and deliberate action. But space can feel isolating when one is accustomed to constant stimulation and feedback. The individual must learn to tolerate silence without interpreting it as rejection or failure. This tolerance is a skill, not a personality trait. Inner authority also demands responsibility without witnesses. Decisions are made without consensus. Values are upheld without applause. Mistakes cannot be blamed on influence or pressure. This accountability is sobering. It strips away excuses and exposes the individual to themselves in an unmediated way. Few people choose this path willingly. Most are pushed toward it by disillusionment, repeated betrayals of expectation, the realization that conformity does not guarantee safety. When external structures fail to provide meaning, inner authority becomes a necessity rather than a preference. But necessity does not soften the loneliness. Those guided by inner authority often feel misunderstood. Their calm is read as distance. Their selectiveness is read as rejection. Their unwillingness to engage in drama is read as lack of care. They may be accused of withdrawing, even as they are becoming more present with themselves. This misunderstanding is painful because it cannot be corrected through explanation. Inner authority cannot be justified without undermining itself. To explain is to seek validation. To defend is to re-enter the very dynamic one has outgrown. So the individual learns to let misinterpretation stand. This is a quiet form of grief. It is the grief of releasing roles that once provided identity, the helper, the mediator, the one who adapts. Without these roles, the person must discover who they are without function or approval. This discovery is intimate and solitary. Yet within this loneliness lies a different kind of connection. Relationships that survive inner authority are no longer based on need. They are based on choice. They are fewer, but they are real. There is less performance and more presence, less agreement and more respect. These connections do not fill the loneliness completely, but they transform it. Inner authority does not eliminate loneliness. It refines it. The individual learns the difference between being alone and being unsupported. They learn that solitude can be grounding rather than isolating. They learn to carry themselves without collapsing into self-rejection or arrogance. This self-caring is the foundation of psychological maturity. What makes inner authority lonely is not the absence of others, but the absence of illusion. Illusions of control, of guaranteed belonging, of shared unconsciousness. Letting go of these illusions creates a clarity that is both liberating and sobering. The loneliness of inner authority is the price of living from an internal center rather than a borrowed one. And while that price is real, it is also what makes a life coherent, deliberate, and anchored in something that does not disappear when the crowd turns away.